Good morning, everyone, evening, afternoon, night, middle of the night, whatever it is, where you are. Hi, loads of people. Where are we? South Arizona, sunny Inverness, Wimborne, where are we else? Abu Dhabi, Malaysia. All over the place. So welcome. It's happy Monday time. It is also the most depressing day of the year because it is the last day that I will be 30 something, which means tomorrow I'm 40 something. And this is not the lockdown I imagined for my 40th birthday, but there we go. We're all having fun at the moment, so let's get on with playing with some photos instead. Before we get started, just a couple of things. So everyone, hi from Italy, hi from, we're all over the place today. That's cool. Those of you that are watching on YouTube, you can thank, I think it was Jerry for that. We got a request, can we live stream to YouTube at the same time? So we did a bit of a panic and got everything. So hopefully it's all working in between the two channels. If it's not working, then let us know. Good to see that Paul Anderson is still in his RV in Italy. Sorry about that. Greeks in Germany, people in Nashville. Yeah, we're an international crowd today. Right, so a couple of things for those people that have just joined. Just bear in mind there's about a 10 to 15 second delay on your comments getting through while we're editing. That's the way that the streaming works, unfortunately. So if you do put a comment in, just bear in mind we're not ignoring you. You're not being isolated. It's just a case of it takes a little while for it to appear on the screen. So let's get going before I hit 40. First off, let's cover the version. So we are covering version 20.0.4 today. That version is quite important. I'll cover why in a second. So the version that's live out there at the moment of Capture One is that version 20.0.4. If you don't have that version, I would recommend downloading it. If you want to upgrade to it, then so be it. But that's the version that everything today is going to be relevant to. The reason that's quite important is last week I let you guys sort of give you a little bit of a link to a preview that the guys at Capture One did. That technology preview is for an upcoming release, let's call it that. It's a free upgrade or update to version 20, and there's a couple of extra bits that are added on there. There's a couple of hints on the screen that you've got up there, but I would recommend going to the Capture One site and having a look at the technology preview they did last week. That will show you what's coming up in the next release of version 20. So for everyone that's either got a subscription or if you own the perpetual license of version 20, it will come free of charge. It's part of the deal with version 20. And those tools have, I mean, they'll cover them in detail, but basically there's some significant improvements on the healing brush and there's some amazing cool stuff for previewing. So have a look over there on their channel, have a play with it, with the video. The second that we're able to actually use it live, we will do, and that'll be on one of the upcoming sessions. But in the meantime, just bear in mind, get hold of that version, because it will come with the cool, funky, new, exciting tools very quickly afterwards. Right, let's go into our sessions for today. This is Jerry's picture. So I think this is YouTube Jerry, so he's now going to be called YouTube Jerry from now on. So hopefully this is coming out nice and clear on YouTube as well as Facebook, still, despite the fun and games this morning. Thanks to Mr. Grover, who has said, yes, the changes are very exciting. Mr. Grover also helped me fix some video stuff this morning. So let's have a little play. This apparently is quite an old image a few years ago, wasn't edited, and we're going to try and basically pump it a little bit, because I'm pretty sure that balloon wasn't this sort of dull colour that's come out in the raw. What it was probably is quite vibrant and quite vivid, but we've got a bit of a challenge here, as always. Challenge is always dynamic range. So we've got a huge amount of highlights up here, a lot of stuff that may be slightly overblown, and we've got some shadow here, and unfortunately, because of the direction of the sun and the light, the shadow appears to fall in a way that it creates a silhouette out of the balloon. I've seen some amazing silhouettes of balloons, but in this case it'd be quite good to get the detail up. I've also just seen on there's a selfie stick and a drone. So this is, I don't know whether it was a PR shoot or something like that, but anyway. Let's start off with that. So for a start, let's have a look just out here. All of this stuff, this highlight stuff on the high edges of the contrast, well, we don't have the lens profile for this, so we're going to have to use Capture One's generic profile. That's fine. We're going to turn on some chromatic aberration fixing and Let's F9 on this particular lens. I'm going to turn on diffraction correction just in case. I don't think there's much purple defringing, but as we start to play with some of the highlights and stuff, we might see some. So I'm just going to put a little bit of adjustment in just in case. First thing we're going to do, and this is always the thing, we always cover this whenever we're doing exposure stuff, see what the camera actually saw. That's number one rule in all of this. So let's get the lens corrections in first, and then let's see what the camera saw, because only when we know what the camera saw can we see what we can do with it. So up here, if I turn on my exposure warning, which is this triangle up here on the top right, whoa, lots of stuff that's warning us that it's overexposed. Now, it's not necessarily saying it is completely overexposed. It's telling us that in my settings and my preferences, it's above the level of 254 out of 255. So be very careful in this area is what it's telling me. What if I turn down the exposure though? Let's just have a look at what's in those areas. And actually, there's loads of detail. We've got all this cloud stuff here. We've got all this texture, which is wonderful. So we have actually got, even though we've got this exposure warning going on, we've actually got, and we can use the exposure warning to help us here. So at the point that it disappears, let's call that 2 stops. So 2 stops under, and we've got the right exposure for the sky. And that's how we can tell that. So our exposure warning's gone. There's nothing that's now clipped. We're at -2 on exposure, great. But -2 on exposure obviously is going to screw up our shadows, so we've lost everything in detail there, which is the whole point of trying to get this back. So let's use some of our high dynamic range tools to pull that back, but we're also going to be careful of trying to pull up some of the color in this balloon itself. So with the outline, we can do this in 2 ways. The first way, we could actually just do a massive, great big fill there. Let's fill that mask. Luma Range, and we could use a Luma Range. And we just slide this until we see only the sky. The sky's starting to disappear there. Okay. Now, if I turn on our grayscale mask, I can see it's got some of the balloon, obviously, because there were white parts on the balloon. They're the same Luma Range as the sky. So I could, if I wanted to, erase them. That's pretty easy, because we don't want to make them any duller. We want them to actually pop a little bit in a minute. So let's get rid of those little stars. Whoops. Let's switch to my hand tool so I can move around a little bit more. Cool, so now with that one Luma Range, let me just turn the mask off again. So Luma Range, we've told it everything that's bright and everything down to about halfway on the histogram. And then from there, pull everything into one mask. So let's apply that. Perfect. With that Luma Range, we could now pull down our exposure. And it's only going to affect the sky. Now where we've got this area up here, where there's all this jaggedy stuff, all these halos, let's just adjust that Luma Range. And the way that we're going to do that, let's display the mask, and we're going to put a little radius in. And that's going to soften the edges of where that Luma mask is. So we see that? So without the radius, let's put that to 0. We get this hard line all the way around the balloon. With the radius, we start to blur that line. Now we don't want to do too much. You can see there it starts to really soften at the edges, but probably about there is probably good enough. So now we've actually got a mask here, and I'm going to call this one sky. I can now, because of that Luma Range, I can now independently control the sky. I can change the white balance of the sky completely. That's kind of fun. So we can have it against a blue stormy sky, or we can have it at sunset. But because of that mask, and these Luma Range masks are really, really powerful, that's done in just one click, really easy. So that's kind of cool. So we've now got a sky that's completely separate to the rest of the image. Now with that, we knew that the sky needed to come down by maybe 2 stops. Well, I've pulled it down to 1.76. Let's pull it up a little bit, because it does make sense that it's a little bit brighter. Okay, so we've now got a sky. Let's just turn that mask off so you can see the difference. Wow, in just one click. So we've now got our sky back, all the texture. Now we need to play with the rest of the image. So we've got to play with the balloon. Now, again, we've got 2 ways of doing it. We can do it globally and have to counter it with that mask. So if you imagine, for every single stop I move up on exposure on the main image, to counter that in the sky, I'd have to move down by another stop in the sky. And it's going to start to look a bit flat because we're doing that. So we're basically seesawing between shadows and bright areas. And unfortunately, you then end up in a place where we start to lose contrast. So instead of doing that, let's just undo those 2 adjustments. Okay, pardon me. So instead of that, what we're going to do is we are going to use our friendly color editor. So I'm going to create a new layer and call it balloon. We could also do this with Luma Range as well. But actually, I'm kind of happy. Well, we may use the Luma Range actually to refine this. So let's just, for a start, draw around our balloon. Oops, I didn't turn my mask on. So to turn your mask on, we're going to press M. I'm just going to do it afterwards so you can see. Very, very roughly around the balloon. The reason I'm drawing a mask is we're going to use the color editor, but just in case there's anything up here in the sky or in the ground that picks up the same colors, I don't want to affect it. I only want to affect the area that I've painted in that balloon. So in that balloon, let's go to our color editor, and we're going to do something that doesn't make sense here for a lot of people. We're going to use the skin tone tool. So the skin tone tool is color uniformity. Jim has just asked, let me just put that on there, could we duplicate the mask out and invert it? Absolutely, yes we could. So we'll come back to that in a second as a different way of doing it, but yeah, absolutely. So if we've got one for the sky, we can do the inverse of that mask without the sky included, but we'll do that in a second. So with our balloon, let's go and choose a color. Now, as I say, this is called the skin tone tool. And the reason is because it was designed to start with skin tones. So it was designed to flatten skin tones and make them more uniform, get rid of blemishes, get rid of any highlights and imperfections. But it also works, and I think a couple of, or certainly some of you have seen a couple of sessions ago, we did it on the sky. So you can use the skin tone tool to flatten the tonal difference in the sky. So if you've got lots of variance between blues up there, you can smooth them out with uniformity. But you can also use it on anything, so we can use it on this balloon. So, in fact, for a start, let's have a look. There's a patch on this balloon, I believe. I don't know who was in the basket, but that balloon's definitely had a hole in it at some point. Let's use our skin tone tool. So I'm just going to stretch the area that I'm focusing on. And with the tool, I can now say, do you know what? All of these different purples, I want you to make them all roughly the same hue. So you see the color changing on there. Okay, and I also want you to make them all the same saturation roughly and all the same lightness. And actually what I'm going to do is increase the saturation overall in the purples, and let's just change that hue. So we can change the hue a little bit too, make it a little more pink. I'm going to make it a little lighter. Okay, so if I turn this off and turn it on again, you see how we've made some changes. But it's only affecting the balloon, it's only affecting the color. In fact, it is creeping around here, and some of that is because we started to encroach on that sky color up here. So let's just make sure we're only focusing on the balloon. There we go. So by altering this little arc in here, I can say actually only this amount of saturation, only this hue range. With that, then apply this uniformity, this amount of saturation, this amount of lightness across the board. So we can enrich that balloon, but also let's just pick on Jim's point. So just so you can remember, the point was, can you duplicate the mask and invert it? Yes, we can. So that was one way of making the balloon a little bit richer. The other way, let's go to our sky mask. Let's turn that on so we remember what it looks like. So I can literally, we can copy, well, sorry, let's create a new layer. And let's copy our mask from the sky. So we've now got the same mask on this layer and this layer. But on this layer, I'm going to right click and say invert the mask. So what I did was I created a new layer, copied the mask from sky, and we knew that sky isolated the balloon and everything else, it was only on the sky. Pasted the mask, so on here we go copy mask from and choose a layer. Effectively we paste that mask onto the balloon. Let me just go, why are we getting a weird masky thing going on? Okay, so with our balloon here, what we should have, ooh, that's not very good, is it? Let's have a little look as to what's gone on there, because the mask may not be rasterized. Right, I'm just going to rasterize the mask a second. Let's copy the mask from the sky again. That's better. Okay, so given that Mr. Grover is on, let's have a little chat later, David, as to why I didn't copy the Luma Range and reverse it. But it's probably my doing rather than the software. So with this one, I'm going to call it balloon. Oops, that's two L's and ground. Okay. Yeah, so Walter's put up there, we erased some areas in the balloon in the original. We did, absolutely. But it should have also pulled across the Luma, so effectively the erased parts should have just inverted as well. So what we erased should have been painted, but the Luma should have come across as well. So let's, we've now got our balloon mask, which is separate. So let's just turn our mask on so we can see. Yep. And with, oops, sorry, invert that. So now we have our ground and our balloon completely separated. With this mask on its own, we can go back to our exposure tab. We can, if we want to, increase the exposure a little bit, but I'm probably not going to do that. We're going to do that with saturation instead. And pull up some contrast. And we're going to lift the shadows a little bit. And let's pull up the blacks a touch. Well, we've got this issue down here with the ground. We don't want that too much. So what I'm actually going to do is create another layer. Just call this one ground. And with ground, it's kind of like layers, so it's an overlay. So I'm going to draw a nice little gradient layer over here and say only with the shadows, and this is weird, so normally we use high dynamic range to pull shadows up. With this one, we're going to pull the shadows down. So it's only affecting the area down here and only affecting the areas that are in the lower part of our histogram. That ground one there. Again, we could use the color editor if we wanted to bring it up to be more green, but that's completely up to you. So with one simple tool, we have a sky that's fixed with just a Luma Range and a filled mask. With another tool, we can play with the balloon colors. We can actually make it a little more uniform, a little less noisy. And on top of that, we could then put another mask, which is the inverse of that sky one. I'm just going to pull that exposure down just a touch. And then the ground mask, which then takes away this distraction down here. So we go from, let's just clone that variant and reset. We go from our original image there to that image there. Now, obviously, because we've now got all these separated, we can play with them a huge amount. So we could take, for instance, the balloon and ground, and we could actually now push the brightness, not the exposure, because I don't want to overexpose any of the edges around here. Pull the brightness up, and then to counter that with our ground, we're going to pull that brightness down on just that gradient there, so it pops a little bit more. So we go from there, which is very silhouetted, doesn't really pop, up to here. One final thing we could do with this overall image, if I create a new filled layer, I'm going to call this layer clarity. Oops, my brain's not working today for typing. With our clarity, I'm just going to put a little bit of a boost on. So there's our difference there. Let's go into here and see. So there's our original on the right, and there's our image on the left. To be honest, most of the changes that we've just done were nothing to do with ground and the balloon or anything of that masking. It was mostly about this sky. And that sky is a really simple mask. All we're doing with the sky is we are selecting this whole area here and saying, right, with a Luma range, only select the stuff that's bright in the image. And then with that stuff, let's pull down the exposure. And that was all it took. So from there to there, easy. Next one, Paul with his architectural shots. So I will admit something here, which is I played with this one a little bit before we came online. Normally we'd sort of do it a bit fresh, but on this one it was bugging me a little bit, and I think I found out what's bugged me. First off, I'm going to load in some corrections in here. It's f3.5, you know, it's a wide open lens, 12mm, so we've got quite a bit of distortion in there. At first glance, I thought this image was perfectly square and it's just a perspective shift. And then I started playing with Keystone and it became a bit more of a problem. So what we can do is let's load on some guides. So up here, if you don't have the guides tab up here, right click, customize toolbar, and let's just pull on the guides option here, and we can just pull it up to here like I've got it on mine. So with guides on, let's just, oh sorry, let me just, I've just forgotten to see something a second, so just go back to Walter. I think it just meant that as some of the balloon ended up as part of the sky in the original because of the Luma, so when inverted it removed those areas, they remained in the sky. It didn't copy the erase brush. The impression I got is it did the opposite. I think it actually copied the erase brush but didn't copy the Luma range, which is a bit more concerning. So we'll have a bit of a play with it. I think Mr. Grover and I will play with it later on and just work out what was going wrong. It was probably my fault. If not, we'll make sure that you will know it was David's later. So let's go on to Paul's ceiling shot. So when I pulled up these guides, and these guides are very useful. So yes, we can have a grid on the image for sure, but the guides we can move around. So with these guides, I can just place them on the pillars and see, yeah, these are roughly straight. There's a bit of distortion, so we might want to play with that in terms of the lens, so how much it distorts, or how much correction it puts into that distortion. It did a little bit too much, it overbaked it. But on this bottom guide here, we can see, even though these are roughly straight, and keystoning would fix some of this, this line here, which comes to the outside of this pillar, should really sit here, and this line here should sit here. So we've got a little bit of a skew in the position that was shot, and that makes it quite difficult for us. So let's just try a standard keystone. It needs to be a 4-way keystone because we're trying to correct for the entire thing to get it symmetrical. Let's put one in that hole there, up in the top right here. I'm going to move the next one to the same position on the left-hand pillar. And then we're going to try and work out where that position should be on this bottom pillar, which should be, in theory, in here. And this one should be, in theory, in here. And I'm going to hit apply. Now, one thing that I didn't cover, about 3 or 4 sessions ago, we were doing some architectural stuff at the same time, and we couldn't quite get it right. For some reason, I always set my keystone to 100%. Now, there's different versions of reasons why not to do that. For me, I'd like to know that the tool is going to do 100% correction, and then I can always override it back. So from a percentage point of view, I always have this amount set at 100. Mostly, Capture One will default to 80% of keystone, which means whatever you're doing, it's never going to do it to the fullest extent. It's going to get it to 80%, which means you start chasing it. So one of the things that I personally do is always set this to 100. On that particular image we didn't. On this one we did. I've just double checked to make sure it's in there. Now, with this keystone correction done, you can see how much of a change in perspective this was for these angles. These massive, great big triangles are going to get chopped off. But with our guides, I can still see they're not quite straight. So we've still got a little bit of bowing, but more importantly, look at this line here coming to here. That's wrong. And this line here is coming here instead. So actually, to correct this one, and I've found this quite often, sometimes we have to go a little bit beyond even what the Keystone tool wants to do. So on this case, we're going to pull that out there and pull that out there. And we get a little bit closer, just a little bit. Pull that a bit more, pull that a bit less, a bit more. Okay, not quite there. This becomes so fiddly to get right. It's so fiddly. And it's because the actual perspective shift in the original image. So where it wasn't taken looking straight up, it was actually slightly off at an angle. There's also a slight twist in the image as well. So if I go to our straighten tool and straighten the image up as well, you can see there's a twist there that's now corrected for. We can get pretty much to where we need to be, but it is a very painful process to get there. And as we're shifting stuff, you see things change all around us. This is where a lot of people get very worried, because what happens is it gets out of control. We start to lose control over the corners and everything. So use your Keystone tool as much as you can near the edges, and try, if you can, to shoot as straight as possible at the point that you're trying to capture. It's not always possible. In this case, quite often, especially in churches, I've done it myself, there's something in the middle of the church which stops you actually putting your camera there. ST has just said, try and use the black steel bracing bar as reference on both sides. I can tell you one thing, ST, they are also not level, because I tried that earlier as a little bit of a trick. So if I try and now use this guide here, you'll see that this bar here actually comes off at quite a long angle, whereas these two are actually now level. And the same with these vertical bars here. So unfortunately, we don't have that luxury either. So overall, this is where we end up with some challenges with architectural shooting specifically. And it's because tiny little things become really important when you look at the image up close. That's as close as I can get it. And I played with this, as I say, a bit earlier this morning. It does mean that we lose quite a lot of the image from the sides. It also means that we've got to do a bit of an adjustment to get things into the middle, because we've got this strange area here and here, which aren't quite central. I'm going to turn our grid on so we can work out whether or not we're getting it right. So this side is going to come in a little bit more. We get to about there. That looks about right. So this now, I'm going to turn off our guides and turn off our grid, and I'm going to create a clone of this variant. So to reset it, that is our shot that the camera captured. That is a geometrically corrected version of the same shot. From this, you get, yeah, let me just pull up a couple of these. Good points. So David's just said shooting wider than you might want would be good too. Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, I mean, this one was on I'm presuming it's a crop factor lens, but it was a 12mm lens, so I don't think there's many wider. You can get sometimes 10mm on APS-C lenses, but yes, absolutely. Shooting a bit wider than you need will help with a lot of the loss that you're going to get from the distortion correction. Where were we? Paul, oh, there we are. So it's Paul, there we go. I was a foot or two out on the floor, yeah. I'd use warp and infinity photo in the church of the 16th century. Yeah, so the church isn't even, and you weren't quite in the middle, and it's tough to shoot directly up. So everything's against you in this particular shot, and I've been there, I've done that, and it's not fun trying to get it back. This is as close as you're probably going to get within Capture One. The rest of it, yes, you can use things to warp and try and bend things and whatever and get them straight, but that's probably where we're going to get to with Capture One. Now, with the detail in this church, what we can do, however, is really, really use these clarity and structures. So I'm not even going to bother with a layer on this because we're going to do it uniformly. Up here, we've got a few things that are highlights that are a little bit overcooked. So let's pull down the whites there, and let's pull down the highlights just a touch. There, that's pretty good. And from here, we could do a little bit of leveling up. So you see this side here is a bit brighter, a bit darker than the right-hand side. Well, let's just pull in a very, very quick gradient. That's pretty easy there. And with this gradient, remember, I don't want to affect the shadows. So I'm just going to pull down our highlights in particular. And what we could do it with a curve, but for this sake, I know that an exposure will work just as well. And it's just to even that up, so we get the brightness correct. So we go from there, which is a little bit off, to there. It's a very subtle change. We don't want to make too much in terms of changes into the structure in here. We don't want haloing to appear all the way around the edges of this stuff. It's carved stone. So we do a very, very subtle change, but it does get it geometrically correct, even though it's a bit of a struggle to get the Keystone tool completely right. Use guides when it comes to architecture, not just the grid. You can use the grid, and you can use that grid. I think I've talked about this before, but you can change your grid. Instead of being 3x3, it can be whatever you want. You can have a 9x9 grid. That'll help you make sure that everything's aligned evenly. But if you want to be able to move things around, use guides, not just the grid. And the guides are these red things, which again, you can change their color, but that will help you just line things up in the window. Okay, let's go on to a funky landscape, and let's turn off our guides. So from the raw, there's a couple of things that I immediately want to change, including the big squiggly thing that's probably on the lens. So on here, very, very simple edits. So this one's from David. This was on a tech cam, so I'm not exactly sure what lens we need to load in. I'm not sure whether it was 138 or a 32 or something like that, but in the meantime, I'm going to start an edit, and hopefully David, if he's online, can tell us which lens we need to load in. So some of the tech cams don't actually take in the metadata from the lens. You've actually got to program it in either on the digital back or do it later when you edit. However, regardless of that, let's have a little look up at here. So we don't, David, 138. I don't think we have the 138 in here yet, do we? No, we don't. Okay, so we're going to use a generic lens profile. And let's put on some diffraction correction and some defringing, because we've got some high contrast. Yeah, what kind of bird is this? It's a, I think it's called a dust bird. Either that or it's actually, I think I know the answer to this because I've seen this at Milford Sound. That's probably something walking either on the lens or the filter in the way of a bug or a fly. I've seen the same on my shots. So let's try the dust spot tool. So the circle up here, we can use our square brackets or right click and make the radius bigger and smaller. You make the radius roughly the size of it, just a little bit bigger. and we see if it can get rid of it. And it's done a pretty good job actually there. I can see a little bit there that I don't like though. So instead of the dust spot tool, I'm just going to click on that one and delete it. And we've got a couple of stray things up here as well. So all we're going to do is create a healing layer before we do anything else. Let's create a new heal layer. This is one of the very exciting things that's coming in the next update to Capture One. So have a look at that, because we've got some funky new tools we can use. So with the healing layer, we choose a location as a source. So we use our Option key or right. What is it in Windows? Is it Control or is it Alt? I'm not sure, one of those two. But effectively the Option key, and then click on your source, and then paint where you want that source to be applied. And then Capture One does some clever stuff. It would do some clever stuff if I wasn't on my dust spot tool. What is going on today? Let's switch to brush. So with my brush on a healing layer, we've got our origin here and we've got our destination. So I'm just going to move my origin a little bit closer, and now we can paint into the destination, and it's going to get rid of anything up here from the source here. So if you imagine this is mapped, so it maps it down here and maps it wherever else I paint. So let's go like this. I'm actually going to fix that orientation so we don't pick up any more cloud than I need to. I'm actually going to go way out to just to get rid of that hair. Okay. And then I saw something else on here. Where was it? Down here. So because this direction is going to be different, so at the moment we have to create a new heal layer, and I'm going to create a new source, and I'm going to paint a new destination, and that's going to fix that right up in a couple of seconds. Lovely. Personal choice here, which is contrails. So I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but one of the side effects of the lockdown stuff that's going on is we've got beautifully clear skies at the moment, which are fantastic. So the clear skies mean that we're not seeing contrails up there. Now I've got a general rule with landscapes, and it's a bone of contention with lots of photographers around how much editing is okay and how much is not okay. My simple rule with landscapes is the same rule that we used to apply when I was shooting models, which was we will retouch it to get it back to what was there. And by what was there, we mean what is permanently there. Now, in the case of a model, for example, if they've got a pimple on the end of their nose, would it be reasonable that in 2 weeks' time the pimple wouldn't be there? Yes, probably. And if you go back to the old paintings and stuff, every now and then you'd see a king or queen painted. The chances are if they had a spot on their face, it wasn't going to be painted in. So if it is a permanent feature of that person, we would always make sure that it stays, because that's a permanent feature of that individual. If it was something that was temporary in nature, then we get rid of it. My personal view is we apply the same rule to landscapes. So if there is, for example, a person out here on the horizon, to me, he's not permanently there. It's not part of the landscape, and actually it's quite distracting, so I'm going to get rid of that in a second. Likewise, if there was a piece of trash down here, to me, it wouldn't be permanent. It's not part of the landscape, so I'd get rid of it. If, however, we've got, for instance, this thing here, well, actually, it's one of the features, but what we wouldn't be doing is getting rid of this stick or getting rid of this sand and stuff like that, or getting rid of, let's say, the lighthouse. It would be ridiculous. So something that's a permanent feature, something that's temporary in nature, I'm not too precious over. So on here, to me, this contrail is actually quite distracting. Now, you've got all these other lines down here, but this one is so bold and so different that I want to get rid of it. So again, personal choice, but let's put on a heal layer. And with our brush, I'm just going to change the size. I'm going to trust that our heal layer is going to do a wonderful job. Ignore some of the preview stuff that comes up when you're doing the healing brush. Don't worry about it, it'll get it right. There we go. Now I've got to fix this in a second, but that's slightly different. But just as an overall image, removing that line has just made it back into a serene landscape rather than, ooh, what's that line about? And actually, because to me, if the line had been perfectly geometrically aligned to the horizon, then wonderful, but it's not. So to me, it's a case of it's got to go, I'm afraid. Up here, we just need to do a little bit more work on this particular part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually erase this mask, because I think I tried to be a little bit lazy, and what that resulted in was me not using the right vector for this removal in particular. So these work up here, but I'm going to have to create a new healing layer just for this squiggle here. And with that healing layer, we're going to select an area here and just paint that through there. There. Okay, so we've got a few healing layers on there. As you can see, we've got 4 different healing layers. To be honest, normally we'd rename them as well. We'd actually call them left to right, up to down, and so on, so that we keep track of them. But because I know they're the only ones I want on this particular sky, I'm fine with that. But these are all sky healing layers, apart from the new one I'm going to draw on this guy here. And I think this is either he was walking, or it's again something walking on the lens. So new healed layer, delete man. And we're going to, again, with our brush, a much smaller brush this time. It's going to be a lot more accurate. And we're actually going to, rather than trying to use the sky and get it to guess stuff, we're actually going to use more of the area here that we're replacing on top of him. And that allows us to make it look more accurate. It's more realistic. Okay, and then the same along here, I could, of course, because of the vector, I'm pulling where he was along to that sky. So instead, I'm going to create a new new heal layer, and we're going to call this one squiggly next to guy, because I can't think of anything better to call it. And on here, I'm just going to use this part of the sky here. It sounds weird that I'm going all the way over there, but it means that I know we've got some clear way here. I'm just going to change that vector to there to get rid of the squiggle. Okay, so that's the fixes done. There's quite a lot of little fixes in there. One thing to really bear in mind for those people that are planning on doing something like that in terms of removing that contrail, which is this one here. Let's just call that contrail so we can always refer to it. When you do that, you cannot do that if this contrail appears in this reflection down here, for obvious reasons. It's the biggest thing that I can see. Whenever I see someone, I think, oh no, you photoshopped that badly. When it comes to reflections, this is the biggest thing that stands out. What happens is people will correct things in the sky and they don't realize that its reflection is still there in the water down below. And it's the biggest giveaway that you've done something to the landscape that wasn't actually at the time of capture. So if you're going to remove anything and there's a reflection involved, check your reflection to make sure it's not there. Luckily, in this case, it was just high enough that it's actually just off of this edge here by maths. But in general, just please, if you are going to play around with that sort of tool and get rid of things like contrails, make sure that you've got rid of the stuff that's in the reflection as well. Okay, so now we've done all that, let's play with the sky. So now we can do the proper color management stuff. So sky, we've got a new layer called sky, a normal layer, not a healing layer, not a clone layer. This is going to apply to everything that's below it, so all of those healing things will continue. And we're going to draw a nice soft gradient mask. So you can see it, all of that stuff there. I'm going to let it bleed over to here a little bit as well, because what I'm actually going to do with this gradient mask is play with the white balance. So we can make this warmer, or we can make it cooler. And I'm not yet decided which way we're going to go, but to me, that probably looks about right. I'm going to up our saturation just a touch and up our contrast a little bit. Okay. Now, let's create another empty layer, and we'll call this foreground. And with our foreground, let's do the reverse. Now again, we've got 2 choices with our foreground. So just like before with our Luma range, we could select just the areas that are dark to play with it, but I don't actually need to do that with this foreground because most of it sits in the shadow here that I want to pull up anyway. The midtones we can play with clarity, so we can make them pop a little bit, but if I do that like that, it's going to be too harsh. So instead, what we're going to do is pull the shadows up, so just the shadow work. A little bit of black. So remember, in terms of the HDR slider in here, so you've got highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Quick memory jog. So highlights is the top 25 to 30% of the histogram, this quadrant here. Whites is the top part of it, so the top 5 to 10%. Shadows is the bottom quadrant, so the bottom 25 to 30% of the histogram, and blacks is the bottom 5 to 10% of that. So if you really, really, really want to play with the true dark tones, it's the black slider that you need to pull up. Let's just show you. There, and then gone. But you notice how it's still, when I pull that black slider down, it's still leaving this stuff. This is still pretty dark, but it's not in that bottom 5 to 10% of the histogram. That's considered shadow. So if I pull the shadow down, now we're affecting that amount. So that's where these two things are very, very different. And the same applies with highlights and whites. So with shadows, we're going to pull them up a little bit. And with our black areas, we're going to pull them up a touch, not too much more, but just enough to boost the background. Hi Peter, Peter's from Switzerland. Cool, we've got people joining all over the place. Dave's just said Roland's lenses love dust spots. I can't wait for the tool. So the new tool, so I'm not going to take away David's thunder on it, but have a look at the Capture One preview on it and you'll find that the healing brush tool has got insanely good compared to where we are at the moment. So let's go into our sky. Now with our sky, actually what we can do is we can pull up a little bit of clarity, and that's just going to make some of these wisps appear a little stronger. In fact, no, I want to do the reverse. So it's interesting. I did say sometimes we do this stuff on the fly. I talked about before, on one of the other images we did before, about using negative clarity in the sky. In here, because I know we've got some of these squiggles and I know I've got some corrections, let me just show you what can happen if we do this too much. Too much clarity, even though you couldn't really see it with the healing tool, we have got little remnants of that original contrail still in here and here. Don't get me wrong, this is 100% clarity. You're not going to be using this much clarity. But we can see up here it's having an effect because there are still bits of that correction that's still there. Well, let's put it back down to where we were. Okay, we don't see it so much. But we can use negative clarity in here to really soften out that sky and really get rid of some of those changes. If anything, up here I do really want to, it's actually just below. So it's not actually our contrail, there's actually a secondary line along here, which is a little bit frustrating. So let's have a look at, let's add a new heal layer. I know David's going to love this because he hates the fact that we've got so many healing layers on his image. Let's put on a brush. Let's go to about there. And I'm just going to choose an area here. And we're just going to paint in a bit more there. And we're just trying to get rid of that dark line, which started to appear, which is a little weird. So there we go, nice and gone. Had a question, where are we, from Walter. Is there an increase on how many spots can be covered in the new tool? In the past I've been working on a portrait, I could only hit about 50 spots. I think you can go to 100 from memory on the dust spot tool. I don't think that changes in any upcoming update, but what does change is potentially the amount of healing zones that you can apply. So depends on how you fix your dust spots. If you do it with the dust spot tool, I did one the other day which I think got to either 99 or 100 and no problem, other than the fact that I was bored of clicking by that time. If you're not using the dust spot tool and you're using the healing layer, then the future update to version 20 is going to give you a lot more flexibility in what you can do and how many dust spots you can fix in one go. Okay, so with here, let's go into our picture again. With our foreground, this is going to start to feel a little bit too warm if I start to cool down this sky. So with our foreground, I'm actually going to pull down the coolness just a touch and correct for some of that tint. So as we pull down coolness, they're not related. So just to be clear, Kelvin and tint are two completely different things in that Kelvin is about the temperature of light, so the white balance of the light that's being recorded by the camera, and it goes from warm to cold. Tint is about color cast correction for the old school way that we used to do with filters, and actually still the new school way, it's still there if you're using filters in front of a lens. Tint goes from magenta to green. They're on two different axes. However, what you tend to find is when you cool an image down with Kelvin, not only does it go blue, you also get a little bit of a greeny effect that goes with it. So what you tend to find you have to do to correct things is as you pull Kelvin down, you have to pull tint up just to bring it back to normal. It's all down to what you perceive with your eye as correct. But what I've found as a general rule is the more you cool down an image, the slightly more green the image starts to go, and the more tint correction you need to do towards the right, which is the magenta part of that tint. So with sky, we've got a little bit of room here with our sky to really punch some saturation up here. Not a huge, we don't want to do it too much, but certainly let's get the glow of those cloud wisps really glowing again, so that's kind of nice. With the overall picture, so what I'm actually going to do now, you see how we've got all of this data down here and not a lot up here. So we don't have, for example, any exposure warning. We've got a lot of movement on this side of the histogram to play with. We can do that with our levels. So I'm going to create a new filled layer. Filled layer, and we're going to call that levels. I'm going to do this on top of everything below. So bear in mind, I can change levels on my background layer, and then everything above it is going to apply. But I don't know necessarily the outcome from that because I've made changes in here to contrast, to saturation, to clarity, and so on. If I change my levels on top of all these layers, think of it like a layered sandwich, whatever is on the top is what I see first. So my levels here, it's affecting the image that I've already edited rather than affecting the base layer and then hoping that my edits still work with those level changes. So with our top layer of levels, I'm just going to pull down this bottom slider. Now remember with levels, this one here is input down the bottom, this one is output. So by pulling it down, we'll just run through this again. So this is 0, this is 0. So this is telling it if it was 0, black on the input, then make it black on the output. This is at the midpoint, so in other words, middle grey on the input, make it middle grey on the output. And this one is the white point, so the brightest part of the image should be the brightest part of the input as well. So whatever was input, make that output. But on this image, most of our data, we can see, is actually on the left-hand side of the histogram. So most of it is in the midtones and the shadows. It's not in the highlights. So I've got a whole area of wasted space up here if I want to evenly balance this image. So my output of white is the same as my input of white, but there's nothing white in the image. There's nothing even 250, 240, 230. It's not until you get to about 160 on the scale of 255 that we start to see any data. So by pulling this input slider along, what that's telling Capture One to do is move anything that was 181 out of 255. So, upper middle bright. Make that the brightest part of the image. Make that white. Make that 255 on the scale. So take our input down here and force it to be that output. And what you'll find at the top here, your histogram, it matches what I've dragged this levels thing to do. So the levels won't change. The levels will leave the exact input histogram that you had. So as I pull this down, watch on the top histogram, because the top histogram is showing you your output. So that's what we're actually producing. And that top histogram is showing me that I've dragged all of this stuff here in the middle of the levels, and I've pushed it up here into the highlights. And the way that I've pushed it is by telling Capture One effectively to map these bright areas up brighter, these midtones up a little bit brighter, and leave the dark areas where they were. If I wanted the darker areas darker, I could pull this one and do the same and map it there, but I don't. If I make those dark areas darker, it's just going to become way too contrasty and horrible. So instead, we're using this to map our areas in the middle to upper midtones to be brighter in the image, gives us a much more vibrant image, and then with that adjustment over the top of all of these, now we can play some more. So with our sky, effectively, we could pull down just the highlights a touch and the whites just a touch. So we've got an overall lift thanks to levels, but we don't want to overplay some of these things here. We could, if we wanted to, pull up some structure up there. Certainly down here in this brickwork in here, if I go to our foreground, I really want to put up some structure in there, because so look at this. This is great. Good example of structure in use. So clarity, remember, is a midtone slider. So clarity is a midtone enhancer. It is making things more contrasty. So if I put clarity up, you can see, let me just let's create a clone. And on one of them, if only there was a way that we could see things side by side in future Capture One, that'd be kind of cool. So with clarity adjustment done, here, I can see that I've increased contrast. It's all contrast. It's contrast, contrast, contrast. And it's that mid-tone that we've stretched. So we've made the dark areas of the mid-tones darker, the light areas of the mid-tones lighter. And that gives us the effect of clarity. But structure does something different. we'll reset that. So these are now back to being the same. Let's just make sure we're in the same section here, so you can see it to compare. If I just use structure, look at that difference. Now I'm going over the top. We're over baking it intentionally so you can see it. But what it hasn't increased the contrast necessarily. What it's done is it's played with the edges. So clarity is about contrast. It's about mid-tone adjustments. It's about areas. It's about shapes. It's about making more contrast in what would otherwise be a flat area of the image. Structure is about taking edges and taking textures and taking details and making them pop, making them become more sharp, more alive. It's not necessarily a replacement for sharpening, but it does have a more subtle effect than sharpening. And if I just pull it down to, you don't need much of this stuff. It's 25, 30 on that scale. But if we look at the difference here in this texture, in this concrete versus here, it's a little bit more washed out, a little less detailed. And all that's going to affect is the areas where there is detail in the edges. It's not going to affect any of the areas like the sky or the water down here because there's no structure to play with. So our foreground now has some structure done. We've got some nice colours up here in the grass, and that's come from, in part, because if you remember on our sky layer, the sky layer actually went over this area a little bit. Let me just show you for sure. So our sky, even though it's a gradient mask, actually it's still got about 50% of its effect at this point here on the grass. And of course we pulled up the saturation. That saturation has affected the sky, but it's also made the grass a little bit more rich. The lower part, the foreground, effectively what we've done is we've countered that massive, great big white balance shift that we did up in the sky. So in the sky we've made it a little more pink. Oops, sorry, it's on our levels there. Sky we've made it a little more pink, a little more cool. And then with our foreground, we've just reduced that a little bit, just to keep it looking glowing like it was in the sunset. Where are we? Mark. Yeah, it's really powerful. I like the structure. Yeah, so structure capabilities. I think if David Shedglass is on this, he'll know this because I've told him a few times before on this. Young, youthful men and women do not like structure and clarity because it brings out any blemish you've got in skin. It brings out anything that's even a slight detail. It just enhances it, and by enhance we mean it makes it even more pronounced than what the person might want. With older people, with texture, with when you've got like this sort of 85-year-old grandfather smoking a pipe and stuff, if you want to see every single little bit of texture in the smoke, if you want to see every little wrinkle and nook and cranny in their face, texture and structure and clarity really bring that out. Yes, thank you, David. So I can only use clarity and structure on myself today. As from tomorrow, I will look like an old man with a pipe. Effectively, clarity and structure look great whenever you want to bring out detail, bring out structure, bring out texture, bring out anything like that. But be very careful using it on family portraits unless you want a divorce in the case of your husband or wife, or if you're doing it on someone that believes they have perfect skin. It's a surefire way to make them think that they don't, and unnecessarily probably. So one other thing that we could do with this shot, and it's just about the focus of it, which is I could do it with the foreground thing, but if you look at my foreground mask, if you remember, that mask was, foreground mask. The mask is pretty big. The same with the sky. My sky mask is pretty big. On both of these, they're too much. Instead, what I'm going to do is create a new empty layer, and I just want some fall off, because when I'm imagining this being printed on a wall, I want the edge to fall off in brightness just a little bit. And so up here with our mask, just going to pull down our exposure just in the upper parts, and then that's top fall off. And I'm going to create another layer, a new empty layer, and I'm going to call it bottom fall off, which sounds like a medical problem, but we know what I'm doing. So up here, and with that one, I'm just going to pull down that exposure as well. So let's go back to our original. Oops. So there's our original. It's a lovely scene, and this is one of these really big challenges when you're shooting stuff and then you look at the raw afterwards and you think, I'm sure I saw something more vivid than that or whatever. Remember, the camera's job is to try and get as much detail, as much data into the sensor as possible, and from there we can bring it back to what we saw, and then that's probably more print worthy necessarily than the original. What I would be tempted to do with this is there's an awful lot of spare space up here, even with that mask, even with the gradients. What I'm going to do is switch just to 2x3, which tends to be a slightly more forgiving landscape format. It also means I can be a bit lazy and get rid of that stone just by going down to there. And then with our top fall off, I'm just going to pull that gradient down just a little bit. I'm just going to make it a little harder in line. There we go there. So we go from there to there. Even though there's a lot of layers in this particular one, what you'll find is most of those layers are just to fix the things like the bug walking around the filter and the contrail that was through the sky. The rest of it, if we actually think about it, it's a tweak to the sky, it's a tweak to the foreground elements, it's some adding of texture and so on, and then the rest of it is just playing with levels and playing with some of the fall off stuff. Levels is really powerful for making an image pop. If you see on this, we did a little bit of contrast adjustment. The contrast adjustment was in the sky, but that was just to bring out this stuff. All of this work down here was purely through levels, just to bring up those levels, bring up the brightness, bring up some contrast and make the image pop. So we go from there to there. So where are we? David says that's why I shoot old folks like me. Yep, I'm going to have to switch to shooting old folks like me now. Jim, in the foreground, can the mask that brings up the shadow be reduced by percentage on just the mud? Yeah, so we can. So let's go on to, just get rid, well, I'll leave it up there just for now, so as a reminder. So our one that was the foreground, which is this one that pulls up the shadows, do we mean we want to bring up the shadow be reduced by percentage on just the mud? So we want to darken the mud, effectively, I'm assuming is what Jim means. So yes, we can. Effectively, what we'd have to do is either counter it with another mask, or what we can do is with our mask showing here, I can, what can we do? Actually, I'm going to do it a different way. I'm just going to add another layer over the top. So instead of with that mask, I could do it through Luma Range, but actually it's going to be a bit cleaner doing it this way. I'm going to create a new empty layer above the foreground, and we're just going to call this left hand mud. So with that empty layer, I'm just going to draw another gradient up here very softly, and I'm just going to pull our exposure down just to there. We could also do it with our shadow adjustment, so just pull the shadows, but we could just do it with exposure. That would work just as evenly, and that's just going to give, yeah, I sort of agree, it takes away some of the distraction from here. Sort of works. That's going to be personal choice, but yeah, that works just as well. Where are we? That was Jim. Simon, don't forget your slippers. Thank you. Do you know what? I'm running out of slippers actually, because I used to just keep getting slippers from hotel rooms, but I haven't been to a hotel for so long now. We're out. David's, can you better reveal the lighthouse? We can. To be honest, it's actually slightly off the focal plane. I had a look at this earlier. It's going to be a little bit tough to do because the way that this compression works, I'm guessing that lighthouse is quite a long way away. So we could bring it up. We could draw a little mask. Let's just do an empty layer. Lighthouse. We could draw a tiny little mask around it and make it brighter just a touch. Let's just go to there just so I can see into there. We can be a little bit rough with this. I'm just going to increase our exposure a touch there, and then using the erase tool, yeah, David says 2 miles away. Yeah. So one way to get more of a feature of the lighthouse is to use an even bigger lens than 138. But yeah, I mean, we can increase it a little bit. We can make it pop a bit more. I mean, that brings it out a bit. So if we go to without, that's without there. And with, it's popping a little bit more, but in terms of size, other than using an even longer lens to compress it more, probably not. So Jerry's just said, so you can use levels to enhance the usable dynamic range of the image. Yes, well, ish. So levels effectively is going to pull up the areas of the image that are already within the histogram that we've got access to. So before you play with levels, what you want to do is pull in everything that you've got into that main histogram. So if you've got things that are off the edge on the left, then you need to pull up the shadow recovery and the black recovery. If you've got things to the right, then pull down the highlights and the whites. If you've got the whole histogram off to the left hand side, then you might want to consider using your exposure tool first to pull it up to the right, and then you can use your levels to spread that histogram out. So effectively the histogram, the levels tool is giving you the ability to spread out a very compressed dynamic range. So if you've got an image which is very flat, very lacking in contrast, you can use levels to stretch that out and get a lot more contrast without making it too contrasty. Where are we? Mario, what you did on levels could be done on background at the same final time? Yes, it can. So it's... let me just check what we mean. So backgrounds could be done on the background in the same final time. Results must be the same by capture one definition or not. If you... no. So... if I do a load of HDR correction on top of some levels, I've seen, and it may be just a little anecdote-y thing, I've seen a different result. So if I do levels first and then pull some HDR, I get different to if I pull some HDR and then do levels. That may just be a weird anecdotal thing that I've seen, but I've always tended to do the levels on top of corrections that I've done to the dynamic range to start with. That just might be me being weird though. So Jim, yes, so by darkening that front you force the eyes to the concrete, absolutely. That's where we get to. So there's our original, there's our finished one. Let's go there. So there's our comparison. And this nice shot to put on a wall. That's kind of cool. So hopefully that's 3 or 4 images? One of them, 3, 4, something like that. 3 different images, 3 very different edits to get the best out of them. But yeah, do continue to send through stuff. So send stuff using that upload tool. So paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. Next session, I think, is next week. You'll find the schedule on Facebook and also on our webpage. And I will see you in a week's time when I am in a different decade of my life, which is the most depressing thing I've said for quite a few years. So catch you later. Stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Cheers. Bye.